Hello everyone, so this is a mini coaching lecture from Module 3, Exploring and Practicing Cultural Diversity at Home and Abroad, designed at Hangzhou Dianzi University. So let's look at the basic structure of today's mini coaching lecture. So we're talking about module introduction, so that includes contextualization, theoretical underpinning, learning objectives and outcomes, and then activities overview. And then we'll do teaching step explanation. That includes teachers' instructions in design, student involvement design, assessment design, and teaching methods. And we'll use Chinese and English bilingual in this mini coaching lecture. This is our great Richard team HDU for today's mini coaching lecture. So they are Wang Yan, Miao Liyang, Chen Sheng, and Ren Li. And Wang Yan will do module introduction, and other colleagues will explain the 4 activities in details. And we have 4 activities in this module. The 4 activities invite students to explore the concepts of cultural identity, small cultures, non-essentialism, etc., and consider how they are related to the daily intercultural communication in the higher education context at home and abroad. The activities propose various forms of experiential learning, some of which takes inspiration from UNESCO Manual of Intercultural Competence Development, real stories of study at home, abroad, and media. Students are encouraged to become aware of how different types of identities, such as gender, age, religion, ethnic, and etc., impact on communication with others and the ways in which people construct and negotiate their own and others' multiple identities depending on experiences, encounters, contexts, and interlocutors. Okay, then contextualization. Intercultural encounters, interaction, and experience are obviously important for developing of intercultural competence. Intercultural encounters, however, do not necessarily mean exotic travel to faraway places. When peoples of diverse geographical, linguistic, religious, economic, educational, and family backgrounds are enrolled to higher education level, universities have become an area where increasingly interaction happen among students of different cultures. These activities take inspiration from real story in the higher education of China and encourage students to explore the different small cultures in the context of China. 那么这里我想再来给大家解释一下，我们做这个 module 的一个初衷和出发点和背景是，我们觉得随着这个国际化的发展，中国的大学呢，越来越成为一个跨文化体验的场所。不仅是大量留学生进入了中国大学，而且，因为中国的地大物博和多样性啊，很多学生来自于不同的地方，他们说着不同的方言，他们有各自不同的家庭、宗教背景，所以他们之间的交流也往往成为了一种跨文化交流。所以我们的活动呢，很多是来自于真实的校园生活的一些设计。那么用这种方式呢，来推动高等教育环境中的中国大学生来进行跨文化体验，进而提高他们的跨文化能力。好，接下来我们这儿有几个非常重要的理论的依据啊，那你们也可以在我们的这个 Richard 的这个 pedagogical framework 里面找到一些具体的一些描绘。那么这些术语有 internationalization at home, intercultural competence,interculturality, intercultural encounters, non-essentialism, cultural large and small cultures, cultural appropriation, identity and social identity, and stereotype. I hope that you can find good explanation and detailed descriptions of these terms in Richard's pedagogical framework. So let's have a look at our learning objectives and outcomes. In our module, we have 4 learning objectives and learning outcomes. Firstly, this module aims to enable students to become aware of how people construct perceptions of the self and other, and learners will be able to critically reflect on how one's background influences perceptions of self and Secondly, this is about identity. So we hope these modules can enable students to understand that identities are multiple. So such as gender, age, ethnicity, nationality, geographical, historical, linguistic, etc., and that they are changing, contextual and negotiated. So learner will be able to describe how people construct and negotiate their own and others' identities depending on experience in the context, and interlocutors. Thirdly, we hope learners know and explore different concepts of cultures, such as small and large cultures, and how these concepts can impact on intercultural communication. And the learners will be able to reflect on intercultural encounters, identify successful aspects, and learn from less successful aspects. Finally, this module aims to enable students to become aware of a variety of cultural representations such as ethnic groups and urban life, and able to approach cultural representations from different dimensions. A learner will be able to describe and appreciate cultural representations in different contexts. Okay, let's have a look at activity overviews. And we have 4 activities in this module, and which are very closely related. And I will explain in Chinese because my colleagues will explain English later. 那么这部分我想用中文来给大家说一下啊。那么这4个活动是密切相关的。第一个和第二个也是属于一种 story sharing 啊。那么第一个活动其实来自于Dear Daladov 设计的 UNESCO Manual of Developing Intercultural Competence， 我们把它改编了一下放在这里啊。那么这个活动其实我也参与其中啊，我们航店呢也做了一些 pilot study。那么这个活动是要求是，其实当时的要求是不受任何的时间、空间和设施的约束啊，在全世界任何地方都能够进行一个跨文化训练啊，甚至在非洲的这个草地上，或者说是在帐篷里面都能进行的啊。我们觉得这个是非常有意思的一个活动啊，非常有利于提高参与者的跨文化能力，所以我们把它作为第一个活动放在这里介绍给大家。那么第二个活动其实和第一个活动密切相关的，只是我们的场景搬到了 dormitory 啊。dormitory 是我们大学里每个非常基本的一个生活单位，所以我们希望通过这种 story sharing 的形式呢，让参与者能明白更多的什么是 cultural identity， 什么是 small cultures 啊，什么是 non-essentialism perspective 啊，用这种形式呢来与他们的这个日常生活相连接。那么第3个和第4个活动，一个呢是我们来介绍一下 ethnic culture in China 啊，另外一个呢是介绍中国的城市生活，因为我们觉得在中国的这个大的非常多元化的文化里面 ethnic cultures minority group 是一个非常好的资源。另外一个 urban life， 我们以上海为例啊，那么这是一个非常好的一个窗口啊，呈现中国的多样性文化的特点。好，那么接下来我请我们的3位同事来给大家介绍具体的4个活动。
Activity 1 is Story Circle. The teaching objectives include the following things: demonstrate respect for others, practice listening for understanding, cultivate curiosity about similarities and differences with others, gain increased cultural self-awareness, develop empathy, engage in critical reflection on one's own intercultural competence development, as well as on the intercultural experience. Develop relationships with culturally different ones. 3 things to remember in this activity. Firstly, every person has personal experience that can be shared. Secondly, we all have something to learn from others. Thirdly, listening for understanding can be transformational. Here is the teaching plan. There are mainly 4 teaching steps, which last about 55 minutes. In the first step, distribute the handout to students, explain the purpose of this activity, and explain instructions. Secondly, get students into small groups of 5 to 6 and sit in a circle. Ask students briefly introduce themselves by sharing three words or phrases that describe their background and why those words or phrases are important to them. There should be no interruptions, comments, or questions during this process. Students just take turns introducing themselves. In the third step, in 3 minutes or less, each student tells about a specific memorable experience he or she has had with someone who is different from him or her in terms of age, religion, gender, socio-economic background, cultural background, nationality, etc., and what he or she learned about him or herself and other people in that experience. Still, no interruptions, comments, or questions in this process. Once all stories have been shared, then engage in the flashback time. Go back to the first story, and each person, other than the storyteller, shares a specific memorable part of that person's story in about 15 seconds or less. Then go on to the second story and so on, until flashbacks have been shared for all the stories. In the last step, once the flashbacks have been shared, together students will discuss some of the following questions in the remaining time. For example, what common themes did you hear from the stories? What surprised you? What challenged you in the stories you heard? What did you learn about yourself through this experience? Finally, the teacher will summarize the activity in relation to the key elements of intercultural competence, and then give instructions for follow-ups as the further action. Here is the follow-up. Students are supposed to finish this assignment, which is participants' action plan. They're asked to write a reflective journal based on their experiences of Story Circle. First of all, they're going to identify 2 or 3 intercultural elements, which include respect, openness, flexibility, curiosity, and so on. And then they're asked to reflect on this question: what will you do to further enhance, develop, and practice these intercultural elements? And here are some examples given to the students. At the end of the activity, students are going to complete the following self-assessment grid according to their experience of this activity. And that's all for the first activity. Activity 2 is My Dormitory Story. This activity encourages students to explore the concepts of cultural identity, small cultures, essentializing, etc., and to consider how they're related to their daily intercultural communication in the context of home. Here is the teaching plan. There are mainly 3 teaching steps which last about 35 minutes. In the warming up, get students into small groups, and then they make a brief introduction of their dormitories and discuss the following questions. For example, did you have any expectations of people from that place? Did your expectations turn out to be true? How did your roommates react to your preconceived notions about him or her? Did he or she show to perceive her or his regional origin relevant during your interaction? And then what about you? Did you feel regional belongings as relevant? The second step is introducing core concepts and critical self-reflection. Introduce the students to the concepts of large, small cultures, non-essentializing, stereotype, and identity, especially that identities are multiple, changing, contextual, and that identities can be ascribed and negotiated. Ask the students to work in small groups and share their views of the following questions. Number 1, in the warming up activity, do you notice any instances of stereotyping or essentializing? How did they impact in communication? Second, in the warming up activity, do you notice any examples of failure to recognize and negotiate multiplicity of one's identity and culture? Thirdly, what can you do to facilitate a better communication with your roommates? In the last step, teachers will distribute the handout, which are 2 excerpts about dormitory life taken from students' assignments. Then, The teacher will organize students into groups and draw maps of small cultures based on either of the two excerpts. Each group then explains their map to the other groups. Then encourage students to extend a scenario of dormitory where multiple small cultures coexist to other situations in their daily life. So in this step, students mainly relate the small cultural views in the real life by drawing maps of small cultures. And then here is the follow-up. The students are asked to finish a homework. With the same group of the classroom activity, students prepare to interview a sample student on campus on diversity in China. Before conducting the interview, they will identify a sample of students from other cultures in order to have a variety of perspectives and experiences. Make sure that they interview international or Chinese students from some minority groups. They reflect on and write 3 to 5 questions to ask their interviewees. And then they will conduct the interview and write notes. Each group writes a report on their findings about 300 words. In the next class, students may discuss similarities and differences as resulted from the reports of the various groups. The teacher takes the opportunity to introduce some of the theoretical concepts, for example, minorities, representation, and power. And last of all, the students are going to complete the following self-assessment grades according to their experience of this activity. That's the end of Activity 2.
Activity 3 focuses on cultural representation of ethnic groups in China. This activity aims at raising students' awareness of cultural representations and enable them to read and appreciate representations in a variety of spheres, say architectures, decorations, ceremonies, etc. Also, the text reading part in this activity is to sharpen students' sensitivities in exploring others' narrative compared with self-narrative. If the goals are achieved, students will be able to describe and appreciate cultural representations in different contexts. With these objectives in mind, the class is designed to have 6 steps, starting with the warming up section. In this section, students are encouraged to share their pre-understanding of any ethnic groups, to say their names, describe their costumes, dances, etc. And in this process, teachers will spot the moment and introduce some keywords like cultural representations, cultural appropriations, etc. And these 2 sections will take up like 10 minutes or so. And with these terms equipped in students' mind, the student will move on to the 3rd section, which is a discussion part based on reading. Teachers could choose to distribute the reading material in class or before class. The purpose is to make sure the students attain sufficient understanding of the text. And anything new or surprising for the students in this text are very likely to be the hotspot of the discussion. And through this reading and discussion, students will come to see the meaning of cultural representation and knows what to look at for the possible meaning. After the discussion of text in section 3, the teacher is to guide the students to look at their own life and surrounding in section 4. In this section, students will compare and apply what they learned from the reading material to the real life. This part, the discussion will be conducted in the form of groups, and the members could supplement and modify their opinions. These self-reflective explorations help deepen the understanding of cultural representation. After the sufficient talk about ethnic cultures, the teacher will lead the class and move on to section 5. And the attention will be called back to the reading material. This time, the attention is paid to expression and narrative. The class will discuss and locate the expressions with special cultural meaning. At the end of the class, the teacher is to summarize and comment on the student's application of key concepts. Apart from that, instructions will be given for the follow-ups, which covers both assignment and self-assessment. The assignment is to ask students to search for an article or video about Chinese ethnic groups by a Chinese author or director, which is to be compared with the reading material by a foreign author. After the class, students will compare their learning results with the ideal achievements listed in the left column, and they will have a clear idea about what they have learned and what is to be learned.
Activity 4. Cultural diversity and its representations from the perspective of metropolis studies. In this activity, students will explore cultural representations of Shanghai and other metropolis all around the world, and see how a great variety of features of these big cities attract people from different regions and countries. Through comparison and contrast, they will learn how to review cultural diversity and gain a sharper awareness of their own living context. The teaching objectives are: it enables students to catch cultural representations in urban life, especially due to the comparison between the life of the big cities and their own hometowns. And also, it will raise students' awareness of their own cultural representations to gain the perspectives to view themselves and find their own identity. The third one is to enable students to approach cultural representations from different dimensions, that is, from the perspectives of others and from the perspectives of self. And for the final learning outcomes of this activity, the students will be able to describe and appreciate cultural representations in different contexts. For the lesson plan, there are 4 steps. For the warming up section, it accounts for 10 minutes of the total class hour. So generally, what we suggest is that you may pick some of the pictures from the major cultural regions, for example, Asia, Middle East, Europe, North America, South America, Australia, and Africa. So try to find out one metropolis cities from all these 6 cultural regions. Try to have them describe and study the pictures and do the comparison between the features of these metropolis and then the features of their hometown, and ask them if you are to recommend one feature of that, what it would be that impressed you most. And then it encourages students to think about history and representations of all these metropolis all around the world. And then maybe you can also ask the students to choose their favorite metropolis from all these different 7 or 6 cultural regions, and let them to describe and to discuss what is the most attractive spot of their favorite metropolis in these pictures. And the second part of the class will be the critical reading and a plenary discussion. So you are going to distribute the attachment 4 and conduct a faster reading among students. And the document is called Shanghai Colorful Blending of Diverse Cultures. And this is the script of the interviews. And then you will find out a table, and you may ask students to put down the background of each interviewee, and then call students' attention to the nationality of the interviewees, and then how many years they've been staying in Shanghai, and find out what they find attractive about living in Shanghai. Encourage students to compare their notes in pairs and guide the students to analyze how people with different cultural background view the life in metropolis. And then they may share the ideas among the groups and divide the students in groups to reflect on life in their hometowns after the reading. Ask each group to pick 3 or 4 questions among these 7 discussion topics or questions, and conduct a 5 or 10 minutes discussion. And then after the discussion, invite each group to do a 3 minutes report on the comparison and contrast between life in Shanghai in the interview and in their hometowns. Share the ideas in the class by the 3 minutes report and draw students' attention to people's constructing perspectives and perceptions of self and other. Finally, for the follow-up activities, you may summarize the activities related to the objectives and some of the key concepts, such as identity, perception of the other, and perception of self, large culture, and small culture. For the homework, the main task is to design a one-day cultural trip of your own city and require students to write a report about how are they going to plan for the one-day trip and focus on the cultural background and the cultural features of the city. For this homework, the focus should be the perceptions of other and the self. Try to encourage students to explore the city both as the local and the aliens, and then learn to view the city from the perspectives of the insider and outsider. Finally, there will be the self-assessment table. You may ask students to summarize and give the feedback about all these 4 aspects of the learning outcomes.